Would you feel the same way if the protest was for immigrant rights or for LGBT and it was this successful? And I mean by successful that it's been able to shut down the state. Because isn't that, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, isn't that the point of a protest? To make
Well,
those in power uncomfortable, to disrupt the order, to make them pay attention to you, to make them come to the table to compromise? Hey, what is happening? You are listening to The Brown Perspective. This is RO, and I'm here with Eduardo. Hey, man, what's going on?
just looking up north to seeing what's happening up there.
What is happening with Canada and GoFundMe and Bitcoin and the truckers and the protests and tyranny and you hear everything. When you're on Twitter, you hear every accusation being hurled
It's
around.
interesting. It's like all of the current events coming together in one place, one protest.
Yeah, so let's break down what has been happening for the past maybe 2 weeks in Canada. So it all started with the organizing of the convoy, the truckers in Canada, specifically in Ottawa, shutting it down essentially because of their protest to vaccine mandates. So it started out as a protest. There's been a lot of protest around the world around mandates, and there's been a lot here in the U.S. There's been coverage. There's usually people take sides. Usually the conservatives are against
Hmm.
the mandates, the liberals are for it. I think it's really interesting that it shows you what happens when a protest is effective. Because if you think about
Hmm.
all of the times that the liberals are out there, the progressives are out there protesting against police brutality or against injustices or for LGBT rights, the point of the protest is to make those in power uncomfortable, to try to be peaceful and to try to bring enough pressure to the state so that they can come to the table and negotiate with you and come to some resolution, some compromise. And in this case, the truckers are being very effective because they've essentially shut down the economy, and it's
Hmm.
hurting the province in Ottawa, and it's hurting the whole country. So now the government has a choice. Okay, we'll come to the table and negotiate with these guys. Well, what does that mean? Well, does that mean giving up the mandate and scaling back, or are they gonna try to shut them down? So now you see the protesters are being very effective, and then you see the state upping up the ante and saying, "Oh, we're going to put more pressure on you guys to try to disperse, to try to break your protest." And in this case, because it's trucks, I think it's really hard to use some of the classic tactics that we know the police force to use. For example, like agent provocateurs, you insert one of your own in there to start burning things down. You label the protesters rioters or some other way of describing them that then turns the population against them, and then so far you could start then chipping away at the support of the protest. But it just seems like that hasn't really happened with this protest here. So the state decided to put the pressure by working with the banks to freeze all of the funding that's been going to these protesters. And they had raised, I believe, about $10 million through GoFundMe and other donation sites. And then, in an interesting turn, the protesters turned to cryptocurrencies to to start receiving donations in that sense. So that if you follow cryptocurrencies on Twitter, if you follow that space, then you had all of the cryptocurrency enthusiasts, especially the Bitcoiners, saying how this validates, this proves that Bitcoin has a purpose, that it's a state resistant, that the state can't censor it, that the state can't take your funds. But now the state is also coming after Bitcoin. So this is where we are right now.
Kind of unexpected, right? Because I think for the most part, when you think of civil disobedience, you don't think of Canada, and particularly you don't think of civil disobedience in the middle of winter, and it's cold in the northeast of the US, and it's pretty cold up there in Canada. But I think what's interesting is also seeing obviously how folks here in the US right away went to support them, and then how some of the other folks who are fighting against the mandates and other regulations, how they kind of took on this freedom convoy as a national, as a global movement, actually, to try
Hmm.
to try to bring attention to the discontent with the mandates, with the mask mandates, with the vaccine mandates, and all those things. And ironically, this is happening as we are seeing the light of the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel. But yeah, but to your point, I mean, it's anytime anything goes against a truck, an 18 wheeler, the truck always wins. So there you
Yeah.
have it.
I forgot to mention the most important part, which is that Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, which gives the government broad powers in four areas: public welfare emergencies, public order emergencies, international emergencies, and war emergencies. So you might be reading this and you might think, well, this is how does this apply to the truckers? And part of the response from the state was also to start labeling these protests, the truckers, as violent. And again, that's a common strategy to then try to get public perception against them. But that worked to some extent, but obviously it hasn't been very effective because they haven't been able to shut down the protests. But saying that the truckers are violent, that maybe they're right wing, and now you can make that link to say this is a public welfare emergency or public order emergency. So something that does fall under the Emergencies Act, which then will give the government broad power to do some of the things that it's doing, such as working with the banks to freeze the bank accounts, not only of the sites of the money that has been collected for donations, but also go after individuals that have been linked to the protest and freeze their funds, freeze their assets.
Yeah, and I can see how problematic that can be, and it sounds like the Prime Minister Trudeau is really desperate to try to quell this revolt.
Yeah, and what's again, so I mentioned this earlier. What's interesting is that you have the conservatives that are they're criticizing Canada for taking these measures, but I don't know if they really understand that the Patriot Act gave the U.S. Similar powers when it comes to freezing people's assets. In the case of the U.S., they just have to be able to provide a link to some terrorist activity. So if you in any way are associated or seem to be associated with any terrorist activity, then the state has the power to freeze your assets. And look at the trend that the U.S. has been going towards in terms of protests and in terms of the term terrorist being so casually thrown around these days, which is actually it's a bittersweet, honestly, because remember when all of those acts would be committed by say white individuals, and they would always refer to them as lone wolf acts. Oh, that's a lone wolf. That's a lone wolf. But then if it was a
Hmm.
someone with a Muslim background, it would be terrorist. And then the progressives and the liberals would always say, well, you should call it terrorism also if it's a white person. And now they are a lot quicker to label activities by white individuals as white terrorism. But now part of me is thinking like, oh crap, maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe we should have been fighting all along just for the Muslims not to be labeled terrorists. Because if you can easily label someone a terrorist just based on protests and stuff, then now you can invoke the Patriot Act to freeze their funds. So, something similar going on in Canada.
Yeah, and I think calling folks terrorists or communists, that there's a long tradition. But I also wonder, well, A, is the fact that these truckers, because of the fact of the industry they operate in, which is delivery of goods, particularly at a time where our supply chain has been already interrupted, and the fact that they disrupted some of the major bridges and ways of trade between the US and Canada. I think it was something like 25% of the commerce between Canada and the United States was goes through the Ambassador Bridge, which was one of the bridges that they used
Mm-hmm.
to just stop everything from moving.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. And I also feel that given what happened a year ago in Washington, D.C. with the insurrection, I think that there is a little more concern with white supremacy and these types of movements that can get out of hand, and that can quickly escalate into something even more dangerous.
Would you feel the same way if the protest was for immigrant rights or for LGBT and it was this successful? And I mean by successful that it's been able to shut down the state. Because isn't that, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, isn't that the point of a protest? To make
Well,
those in power uncomfortable, to disrupt the order, to make them pay attention to you, to make them come to the table to compromise?
well, it is, and it sounds like you didn't hear about this past Monday on St. Valentine's Day. There was a one particular influencer, I believe Mexican American or Latino for sure, who was calling for a boycott on a number of goods just in support of Mexican, not only Mexican, but of immigration reform. And clearly that didn't have the same type of economic impact or didn't draw the same attention. Obviously, Univision covered it, but but um, but that was pretty much it. So I think if it was some of those causes, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of immigrant labor that is involved in the trades in terms of building, growing, all those things.
You,
But
are you referring to the boycott of the Driscolli's strawberries? And because there's usually a boycott of those.
no, I
And
think he was calling one for just a boycott, and I think they were trying to push this whole concept of a day without immigrants.
so
But
imagine if
also,
imagine if that boycott was equally successful as the truckers' protest, we would shut
that would
down
be
the
great.
nation.
Maybe we'll get immigration reform passed.
Right, but what if then the state started enacting emergency powers to block the funds of the fundraisers and then start criminalizing those that are donating to the to the protest?
Then
Because
we have ourselves a big problem.
well, that's what's happening here, right? Except that it's truckers. Because yeah, if you call for a boycott of an entire industry and it's wildly successful, you could really damage the specific sectors. You could damage the finances of a state or even the country.
Well, part of it is they made their point, right? And they protest, and it's not that they cannot protest, but then it's when they are impacting people's ability to get around, right? To
But
get
that's
goods,
that's the
to
point of all protests, isn't it? If you just take a
it is.
protest
I
to
mean,
its
it is to be
natural
disruptive
progression,
for
if you want
sure.
it to be successful, yeah, I can't think of a successful protest that's not going to cause economic pain, economic cost to the state, and even an inconvenience to to our fellow citizens.
Well, I think you can say the Montgomery bus boycott was a type of boycott that yes, it hurt the bus company and those who benefited from that economically, but it wasn't disruptive, right? It was just people had to walk to their destinations and the image of people avoiding it, right? So that was one of the why it was so effective.
No,
Um,
it
I think
disrupted
in this case, I think there's a balance, right? Like you made your point, and the part of the problem here is that you are in polar opposites, right? But you also are getting to a point that just now here in the U.S. they're starting to lift the mask mandates. Probably vaccine mandates may or may not be lifted. Probably not because I think COVID is here to stay. Um, so you have these two polar opposite points, and the government's always right.
the government's always right.
Simple as that.
Yeah. Well, earlier you mentioned that they made their point, but that depends on what the goal of the protest is. The goal of the protest, a protest, the goal is not always to just make a point. It's to bring the other party to the table for negotiations, for a compromise. And if the government can stop this by compromising, right? Obviously, they feel
But they
like,
were, but I don't think the protesters want to compromise, right? They just want
well, the government can compromise
to
by
lift.
lifting the mandate. That's what I'm saying. That
Yeah,
could
but
be
that
the
jeopardizes the well-being of millions of other people.
so the government is stuck in a difficult position. And again, no different than other protests, because if you're fighting for immigrant rights and for trying to legalize immigration, the other side can always make the claim that by allowing so many illegals in, by giving them legal status, you've now screwed over other average working Americans. So you've done something to compromise and give something to a group at the expense of another. It's just in this
Yeah,
case.
and then hopefully those same people will complain about, and actually they do. They complain about NAFTA or what they call it, the U.S. Canadian Mexico agreement,
Yeah,
then that's now
NEMA.
in place, and some of the other neoliberal policies that I know we've discussed in at length before, or to an extent.
Yeah. So it's definitely an interesting situation. The other point that I wanted to touch on, which I mentioned earlier, is this whole movement of people that started turning towards Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to bypass the banking system. So now the proponents of Bitcoin are saying this is a huge win because this is what cryptocurrencies were designed for. Except when you are trading in Bitcoin, at least right now, because it's in its early stages. Eventually, if Bitcoin does become mainstream, then you'll be trading peer to peer, paying each other with Bitcoin. But at the moment, people that get paid in Bitcoin, they have to move that money off of an exchange onto a
Hmm.
bank. And it's really easy to see the Bitcoin address where all of these donations are being made. So the Canadian government has decided to blacklist these addresses. And all they have to do is go to the exchanges and say, hey, whatever money's in these addresses, it's frozen. You can't, it can't be moved. You can't withdraw it to a bank account, so it can't be used. You can send the Bitcoin to another address, but you can track, because you can always track where the money came from. You can send it to, like, you can hop around and create another address and send it to another address, but you can always link them. So the money's blacklisted no matter where it moves. Now, you can send the money to another country to withdraw it in another bank that's not going to care. I mean, maybe you could do that. You could bypass it that way. But definitely, this is going to stress test the use case of Bitcoin.
Use case.
Yeah, but I think if the governments were more actively blacklisting addresses this way to stop protesters, I do think that it would probably slow down the Bitcoin adoption somewhat. But eventually, it's just really hard to completely censor and blacklist Bitcoin, because ultimately it is peer to peer, and all it would take would be a specific percentage of the population to start accepting just the Bitcoin directly for things. So, for example, the truckers, okay, so there's Bitcoin in some addresses. They can move it off to a bank account, but they can send that Bitcoin somewhere else, and they can open up new addresses. They can move it to different wallets, and then they could trade with each other. So somebody that supports the protest could say, all right, well, you can't access the money. You can't convert it to fiat. All right, well, I have here with me 2 trucks that I want to sell. I'll take your Bitcoin. And then that person will take the Bitcoin. Obviously, it's blacklisted Bitcoin. So that person is doing something against the state. They know that they won't be able to do it. But it's very early on. It's still hard to see how this is going to affect it. But ultimately, the Bitcoin community is very creative. They might come up with other ways of bypassing this. It's going to be a hard task for the state. But again, it is interesting in the sense that we're watching it real time to see if Bitcoin is really able to do what it said its purpose was, or its purpose is.
Yeah, I
So
mean
yeah,
that's why when I go to protests, I take with me hard cold cash because I can block that from my pocket.
unless they have you on video filming you buying a Molotov cocktail with that cash and then throwing it at something.
Well,
Not that,
first they
not
have to catch me, right? But in the
yeah.
meantime, I have untraceable dollar bills, Canadian dollar bills that I can buy food with and other supplies that I need.
That's right. All right, I think we could wrap it up here. It was just a quick discussion on what's going on in Canada. We'll obviously follow this one closely. Any final words?
No, yes, I think we'll see how this develops. I think it does seem like the Canadian government escalated things pretty quickly. So we'll see how things turn out. And then I'm also looking at images to see if maybe I see Lola la Trailera in one of those protests with the Mexican flag, just in solidarity with the Canadian truckers.
That's a great reference, man. You make me jealous that I'm Mexican and I didn't think of that.
Woo!
All right. For all of you out there that enjoy our content, make sure to check us out. We are Brown Perspective. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Nos vemos.
Shout out to Eric Estrada.
Yeah. Those out there who know, if they know, they'll get the reference.